Hi besties, welcome back to my channel, or hi, my name is Stacy if you're new here. So for today's video, I'm going to be reviewing the new NATASHA DENONA Retro Glam palette, and she looks like this. Sorry for the delay in this review, but I do have 4 looks for you guys. So if you want to see how I got these looks, as well as some swatches and comparisons, then just keep on watching. But before we get into it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe because it really helps on my channel, and it would really mean a lot to me. And let's just get right into the video. Okay, so for the first look, I want to go into the greens in here and just do like an all green look. First, I'm going to go into the shade Fringe, the really light minty green. I'm just going to lightly use that as a transition. Okay, so this color is very light, but it's still deeper than my skin tone. But since it is so light, I can kind of go in multiple times and just build up the color without having to worry about it getting dark. Oops, okay, I actually forgot that I'm supposed to only do one eye, so I'm going to remove this later. Also, I will say if you have my skin tone, it kind of has like this grayish undertone. Like, it's a little bit smokier than a pastel. I feel like that's true for all of the shades in here. Or like, they're kind of like pastels, but a little bit more muted down. Okay, now I'm gonna go into this shade called Sage, and a chunk of it fell out while shipping. That was sad, but it wasn't too bad. It's just a nice, deeper sage green. This one is also showing up deeper than it looks in the pan. I'm just blending out the edges. Okay, next up I wanna go a little bit into this shade Oz. I'm gonna tap that a little bit on the outer corner. This is very similar to the matte shade that we put down, but it's more satiny. It's like a satiny metallic. It's a little bit more vibrant than the sage color. And now I want to go into this shade called Marlin and use this as the main lid color. Ooh, very pretty. This one actually looks lighter than it does in the pan. So yeah, it's definitely like adding a brightness. Like, it's a very shimmery kind of seafoamy color. Then to make it pop a little bit more, I'm gonna go into the shade Palladian. And I'm gonna put this right in the center for a lighter pop. Yeah, this is just like a lighter, frostier version of the previous color. I'm taking a bit of Sage and putting it on the bottom outer corner. Just tie it in there. I'm gonna go back into Palladian. I'm gonna put that on the bottom inner part of my lash line. I'm gonna take a tiny bit of Flutter, which is just like the sparkly champagne shade. And this is like the sparkliest shade in the palette. It has the most noticeable like sparkly micro shimmery particles. And lastly, gonna go into this shade Evergreen. And this is more of that cream to powder, so I have a feeling it's not gonna be that deep, and I'm using this as a lining shade. So yeah, usually NATASHA DENONA's like cream to powder formulas are less deep than they look in the pan. I would say that's somewhat the case here, but it is still like quite a deep green, so that's good. It's like a medium to deep green. A very pretty, slightly subtler lining shade for this green eye look. Okay, so that's all the green shades done. So I'm gonna go off camera to put on my mascara, and I'll be right back to show you the finished look. Okay, so now I'm back with the finished green eye look. As you can see, it's like a very pretty sage kind of green look. But I will say that I feel like NATASHA DENONA's greens usually run quite blue. Like, I'm wearing a green sweater because I thought it would match, and I feel like, hopefully you guys can see in the camera, that the eyeshadow is bluer than the sweater. Yeah, I just want to tell you guys that because it's like quite a blue green, which I feel like does make it a little bit less wearable. I think this is probably the least wearable eye look that you would get out of this. But I did do it in a way that it's like pretty watercolory, so it's the most natural that bright green eyeshadow could possibly look. It is also a little bit like smokier and kind of toned down compared to like true pastels. So now let's move on to the next eye look. Okay, for this eye, I want to do an all pink look, just because I want to show you guys like the variation this palette can give you. So first, I'm going to go into the shade Holly, which is a really light peachy pink. Ooh, that's so pretty. These pinks are definitely right up my alley. And again, this one is actually buildable, and it's deeper than it looks in the pan. Like, it looks very white in the pan, but as you can see on my eye, it's deeper than my skin and just not so pastel looking. I'm gonna add a little bit of Holly on the bottom lash line. And you can see it, this like blends right into my blush. So it's a very nice color. Honestly, you could probably use this as a blush color as well. Next up is this pretty rosy shade called Belle. So I'm just gonna use that to deepen the outer corner. And again, this kind of has like this muted undertone to it. That's definitely a theme of this palette. Like, none of the shades are very vibrant. They actually look more toned down on the eyes than in the pan. Like, you hopefully you guys can see there's quite a bit of like brown and a little bit of gray in there. Very pretty. Like, it's a little bit more neutral than you would expect, because I thought it was gonna be like pink, but it's more like a dried rose color. Okay, now I'm gonna go into the shade Flare. It's the only pinky metallic. I'm just gonna put that over my lid. Very pretty. It's quite like a deep rosy shade. I'm gonna build it up a little. And actually all of these lean cooler than I expected from the pan, because they look like pretty warm pinks in the pan, but these are all more of like a rosy, almost like plummy pinks. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, lastly, I do want to like brighten this up a bit, so I'm gonna add a a little bit of this shade called Flutter. Honestly, this is one of my favorite shades because I just like to top it over like a lot of the looks in here. You see how like it brightened it up and also added quite a bit of sparkle. So this is definitely like a necessity in this palette for me, at least. If you like sparkle and overall like lighter looks, this will just brighten everything up. It also doesn't have too much of a base color, so you can definitely use it as a topper. I think it was meant to be used as like a topper in this situation. Just gonna take a little bit of Flutter and put that on the inner corner again, and put it on the bottom lash line on the inner half. Okay, I love that. That just really made my eyes pop and sparkle. Okay, so there's no deep like pinky shade, but I am gonna go into the shade called Jazzy. And this is technically a metallic, but it's quite deep and not super shimmery. So I just use it as a matte, or like it's more of a satin shade. Okay, so that's a really pretty color just for like a really subtle eyelining shade. Okay, and that's basically all the eyeshadow done for this look. So I'm gonna go off camera to do my mascara, you know the drill, and I'll be back to show you the finished pink eye look. Okay, now I'm back with the finished eye look. Here's the final pink look. You can see it's super wearable, at least in my opinion. It's just like a rosy pinky look, and you can definitely kind of adjust this to your preference because the rosy metallic is actually quite deep. So you could just leave it like that if you like a more smoky pink look. I like lighter, brighter looks, so by adding like a lot of the glitter topper, it really lightened it. But yeah, like I feel like that's super wearable for every day. I would just be comfortable wearing this out anywhere. So yeah, let me know which one you like better. Okay, so now I showed you like the pink and the green sides of this palette separately, but in the last look I will show you like what it looks like to combine the pink and green in one look, just so you can get a feel for that as well. But yeah, first let's move into the third look, which is a more neutral eye look. Okay, for this look, I really want to demonstrate the neutral tones in here. So I'm going to do an all neutral look. And we'll see what the most neutral look we can get out of this palette is. So first I'm going to go into the shade Faye, and I'm going to just put that in the transition. Ooh. So it actually shows up a lot deeper than in the pan. So I'm just going to put that on the other lid as well. I did not expect that transition shade to be that deep. And it also has a very green undertone. So I did not quite expect that. I think it's just because this Faye shade looks super neutral in comparison to the actual greens. But for a neutral, it's very green. Okay, and then just taking Faye on the bottom lash line a little bit. Now I want to take a little bit of the shade Lucy. I'm just going to use that to blend out the edges of Faye, since Lucy is a bit lighter. Looks like the Faye shade, but with some white and maybe a little bit browner, like it's less green. Okay, next up I'm going to take the tiniest bit of Maxi, and this is like a really deep taupe. So I'm just going to put that on the outer corner as like a deepening shade. I would not use the color of this depth on my overall lid for my skin tone, but definitely on a deeper skin tone it would look really pretty because it's quite smoky, as you can see. And I'm just going to blend out the edges of that. Okay, yeah, that blended out really nicely. So now I want to take the shade Oscar as the main lid shade, and this is very pretty. Again, still has that greeny undertone. It's a very nice in-between color. I feel like this is a really nice way to wear green if you're kind of afraid of it and you want it to be like really toned down, because it's still kind of like a neutral taupey champagne-y color that has like a very strong green undertone. And then because everything else in this look leans green, like the whole thing is pulling much greener. I just like that this is a very nuanced shade. Okay, then I want to go into this shade called Flutter, and I think this has the slightest bit of like a yellow or green undertone as well. And I'm also gonna put that on the bottom lash line. Also want to add a tiny bit to the center just to highlight that. Okay, and then lastly gonna go into this deepest taupey brown shade called Jazzy. This palette's deep shades actually have quite a bit of depth, considering this is overall, I feel like, a lighter leading palette. Or like, this is a quite desaturated palette, but I feel like it still has those deeper shades. So I think this will still work for a lot of skin tones. Okay, so that's about it for this eyeshadow. So I'm just gonna go off camera to finish up my mascara, and I'll be right back to show you the finished look. Okay, so now I'm back with the finished look, and I also changed the lip to be a bit more peachy because I feel like that matches better with green, because at first I had a more mauvey lip on. Anyway, so here's the finished neutral eye look, and it actually turned out a lot more green than I anticipated, but I think it's just because these neutral tones look very neutral in comparison to the brighter greens in this palette, but in actuality, like if you compare them to true neutrals, they look very green. So it's like a very like in-between green and neutral kind of look. Like I would say it's the most wearable way to wear green. So I'm actually very pleased with how this came out. It's a very unique greenish neutral eye, but it's still like light enough and neutral enough to like feel comfortable wearing out like for every day, in my opinion. Yeah, it's just very unique, and I do really like how it came out. It's also very soft. You could definitely smoke it out more by adding more of the deeper shades, but I just kept it in a very small area in the outer corner. So now let's move on to the final look. Okay, now I'm back with blank canvas. So for the last look, I want to do a pink and green combo look. So I'm first going to go in with the shade Holly, very cute Christmassy name, and just putting that all over the crease. This is a really nice everyday crease color because it also like matches a lot of blushes, I think. It's like you could just put this on and go, you know? And putting some on the bottom lash line. I'm going to take a tiny bit of Belle and add a little bit to the crease, just to deepen up that pink a little bit. Now I want to take a tiny bit of Sage, and I'm going to use that to deepen the outer corner. So the thing about pink and green is that you do have to be a little bit careful since they are like opposing colors. So like if you mix them too much, they're going to turn brown. I'm also going to take a little bit of fringe to help blend that out. I'm going to add some of the shade Marlin, which is that satiny metallic minty shade. And I'm also going to add that to the outer corner to kind of start blending it in to the center lid. Also, the shade feels very smooth, so I'm just going to blend out the edges. When in doubt, just use a metallic to blend the edges of your mats out, because it really like helps mesh everything together and make it more seamless. Now I'm going to go into the shade Flare. I want this to be quite pink, so I'm going to put that as the main lid color. And don't worry, we're still going to blend these together. I just usually like to place the color first before I like blend it, you know? But then it looks kind of ridiculous at first. Okay, so I'm actually not going to fully blend that yet because I'm going to add some of this Palladian shade as like the center color, because it's light but also it's like kind of minty, and hopefully it will help mesh the two colors together. I'm just adding a little bit of Holly back into the crease just to make it a little bit more pink, especially in the front part. I'm going to go into the shade Flutter and just add some of that also to the center. I'm going to add some of Flutter to the inner corners, add more Flutter to the bottom lash line. Just adding a little bit more of the pinks, Holly and Belle, to the bottom lash line. So adding it to this outer corner here. Okay, lastly, I think I want to do a green liner. So we're going to go into Evergreen. Just using Evergreen as a liner. That definitely made the green more prominent, I think. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the eyeshadow application. So I'm going to go off camera to do the mascara, and then I'll be back to show you guys the final look. Okay, so now I'm back with the finished pink and green look, and I really like how it came out actually. Like in the middle, it was looking a little bit sus, but I do feel like it's giving fairy garden vibes. What do you guys think? I actually think pink and green is a super pretty combination. As you can see, my necklace is pink and green, and I think it's super cute. But anyways, yeah, I think the key is just like you want to keep the pink with where the pink should be and the green with where the green should be, and not like blend too much in between because it will make it kind of muddy and brown because of color theory, because they're opposite colors on the color wheel. I just kept them to their respective corners, and I feel like it looks really good. Comment down below which look was your favorite. This pink and green is actually kind of giving. Anyways, now I'm gonna get into some swatches and comparisons of this retro glam palette. There's gonna be a lot less comparisons than usual just because I don't actually have anything that's like super similar to this palette, but I just wanted to show a couple points of reference just so you have an idea of like how the tones compare to other palettes. But yeah, I don't really have anything like super comparable to this. Anyways, and after that, I'll get into wrapping up my final thoughts with you guys. Okay, so here's the retro glam palette all swatched. As you can see, a lot of the really pastel-y looking mattes actually swatch quite a bit deeper. Like they don't have so much of a white base. I mean, they are lighter than these shades obviously, but overall it swatches a lot deeper and more muted than you might expect. And also like these deepening shades go quite deep for like a muted palette. The only thing is that this shade, this deepest shade, is not a matte, it's more of like a satiny metallic. And this one is a cream to powder. This one's also satiny metallic. So yeah, you don't really have many super deep mattes, but these essentially function like mattes. Also, all of the metallics are pretty smooth metallics, but they are quite shiny. This is pretty typical of NATASHA DENONA, except this one has some micro shimmers, and this one is more of a top coat sparkle shade, but the rest are pretty similar metallics to each other. Yeah, this is what the entire palette looks like together. So now let's get into some of the comparisons that I have. So first I want to compare the NATASHA DENONA Retro Glam palette to the NATASHA DENONA Retro palette. I'm basically going to be comparing the more neutral and pink shades since there are no green shades in the Retro palette. And also I don't own the mini Retro, so I can't compare that one. So now let's get into the individual swatch comparisons. Okay, so here we have Retro Glam on top and Retro on the bottom. So I only swatched the colors that I thought were comparable. So as you can see, there's no comparisons for the greens, but hopefully as you can see, the retro pinks and neutrals are just a lot more pink. None of them are super comparable. I would say the only one that's kind of a good dupe is this one, which is Jude in the Retro palette and Maxi in the Retro Glam palette, but they are still slightly different as you can see. Maxi's a little bit deeper and smokier. But yeah, overall I would say not really many dupes, and most of the shimmer shades are quite different. Even the sparkly topper shades are different. Not super similar in my opinion because the Retro goes a lot cooler. It has a lot more purples in it, which I also didn't swatch here since there's no purples in the Retro Glam. Let's move on to the next one, which is the Glam palette. Next up we have the NATASHA DENONA Retro Glam palette compared to the NATASHA DENONA Glam palette. So here's the two side by side, and with this one I'm just going to be comparing the more neutral shades, considering the Glam palette doesn't really have pink or green shades, and I just want to use this as a frame of reference since both the Retro and the Glam palette are part of the Retro Glam's namesake. So now let's get into the individual swatches. Okay, so here we have the Retro Glam palette on top and the Glam palette on the bottom. So again, the only comparable part is more so the neutrals, but hopefully you guys can see that the Retro Glam neutrals have a lot more green in them in comparison. Even in these like more grayish taupey tones, you can clearly see the green undertone there. So yeah, that's the kind of interesting part. I'd say the closest shade is kind of these two shades over here. This one is Outer Eyelid and this one is Brow Bone in comparison to Jazzy and Oscar from the Retro Glam. Again, you can see how there's kind of a lot more of a reddish undertone to these cool tones, generally speaking, than in the ones here. So that's kind of the biggest difference. But yeah, so that's the two palettes compared. Okay, and lastly I want to compare the NATASHA DENONA Retro Glam palette to the NATASHA DENONA Pastel palette. I wanted to show you guys how these pastel-y looking shades are not actually pastel when you compare them to real pastels. So now let's get into the individual swatches. Here we have the Retro Glam on top and the NATASHA DENONA Pastel palette on the bottom. So I only pulled the colors that I thought were comparable, which are the pinks and the greens. And I just wanted to show you guys the differences, but overall you can clearly see how these greens are a lot more saturated and vibrant and also white based compared to the greens in here. So that's the main difference and kind of what I was getting at throughout the entire video about how the greens in Retro Glam are very muted. And yeah, this pink is a lot more bubblegum, so that's not really comparable either. But you can kind of see what I meant by how the Retro Glam one is a lot more earthy toned because it doesn't have that bubblegumness to it. So yeah, again, not super comparable, but just wanted to show you the point of reference with her pastel palette and how like these shades aren't actually pastels. Okay, so now I want to compare the NATASHA DENONA Retro Glam palette with the Anastasia Nouveau palette, and these just came to mind because they're both like green palettes with a neutral twist to them. So I just wanted to see how similar the greens are and how similar they are overall. So now let's get into the individual swatches. Okay, so here we have the NATASHA DENONA Retro Glam on top and the Anastasia Beverly Hills Nouveau palette on the bottom. And the biggest thing I wanted to compare was the greens, but hopefully as you guys can see, the greens are actually quite different in the Nouveau palette. Most of the greens here have a lot of yellow to them, like they're more olive based, whereas a lot of the greens in the Retro Glam have a blue base to them. So that's the clearest difference you can see here, for example, and like with these shades. Also, overall, the Nouveau palette is an olive and orange tone theme or warm tone theme. Very autumnal, as you can see, these are all like really good autumn tones, whereas the Retro Glam palette is definitely more pink and green. So that's also something pretty different to note. And the Nouveau doesn't really have these types of neutral shades. So not super similar, but I did want to compare the more neutral greenish palettes I had in my collection. So now to wrap up, let's just get into my final thoughts. So what are my thoughts on this Retro Glam palette? Well, my first thought is that this color story is actually really gorgeous, and the quality is the regular expected NATASHA DENONA quality. I think my favorite thing about this palette is the color story. It's very unique to my collection. I don't have anything quite like it, and I feel like it will also be pretty unique to a lot of other people's collections as well. I also really like the particular shades of the tones here because it kind of looks like a pastel palette, but it's not really a traditional pastel like her pastel palette, because pastels are very like white based or just have like a brighter undertone, but these all have a very like muted, dulled, kind of grayish undertone to them. So it's like a more muted pastel palette, which again, I feel like is really unique. Who I would recommend this palette for is someone who already kind of has like a general makeup collection. You already have like your basic neutrals and everything, but if you want to like start experimenting with some color or playing with colorful shadows that are still a little bit more muted and slightly more wearable for every day, then I feel like this is the palette for you. So for me, I really like neutral palettes with a twist, which I feel like this kind of is, because you do have those more basic neutrals Although the neutrals in here lean kind of greenish. But actually, I realized that in certain lighting, it also looks more silvery taupey. But anyways, yeah, so even for the neutral side of this palette, it still has like a little bit of a unique twist to it. But these shadows also do pack quite a bit of pigment, which is pretty normal for NATASHA DENONA shadows. Like you can see how in the pan, they look very kind of dull and washed out. And they look like they might even be like kind of ashy, but at least on my skin tone, these shades showed up a lot deeper than they look in the pan. Like these two super light pastel-y looking shades, they're actually like deeper and look more, I don't know, muted. The shimmers I feel like show up pretty true to pan, or even slightly lighter. Like I feel like this Marlin shade shows up lighter just because they're actually quite like sheeny and reflective, so I feel like they end up looking a little bit lighter. I feel like even if you have a deeper skin tone, like even though this kind of looks ashy in the pan, I feel like it's not actually ashy on the skin. Obviously, definitely you want to confirm that with like people who have deeper skin tones, but just from my experience, these are quite pigmented and don't have as much of a white base as you would expect. So that's also why I don't think this is like a true pastel palette, because they have like this muted undertone to them. I am really glad I picked this up. It's probably one of my most worthwhile purchases in a while, as in like I don't really have many dupes of this, so I am very happy to have this palette. I just want to mention that like not all of the metallics are super impactful, so if you're looking for that like super high impact kind of shadow, it's not going to be in here. So that's just something to be aware of. The mattes, I feel like they blended super seamlessly. They're very silky smooth. There is some kick up in the pan. I didn't really notice much fallout. I think there was like a little bit, but nothing crazy. These are all pretty typical of NATASHA DENONA shadows, so like if you're familiar with the formula, you're not going to be surprised by anything, I don't think. But yeah, just to let you know if you aren't familiar. I feel like the main reason to pick this palette up is if you want versatility, because I feel like you can get very different looks out of this compared to a lot of other palettes. Like at least this has 3 very distinct color stories, and then you can kind of mix and match as you want. I generally gravitate towards more monochromatic looks. I feel like it's very easy to see that within this palette, but if you want to like mix and match opposite colors or complementary colors, you can, like I did in this look today, and I feel like it turned out really well. Yeah, overall I'm very satisfied with this palette. If you specifically like the color green and like sage types of greens, I think you'll like this palette. If you don't like green, you probably shouldn't pick up this palette, just because that is like the main attraction. Because even though like the tones of the pinks and the neutrals are kind of interesting, it's still like not enough to be different from like a traditional neutral palette. So the green is what's really making this special. So if you don't like green, there's kind of no point in getting this, I feel like. But overall, I like that you can get green looks and neutral looks out of this. Anyway, that's about all my thoughts for this palette. Let me know what you guys think if you already picked this up. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and comment and subscribe down below if you want to see more content like this, because it really helps on my channel and it would really mean a lot to me. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.